The evening had grown heavy with the kind of dampness that seeps into one's bones. St. Audley's Manor, perched like a stubborn relic on the edge of the downs, loomed dark against the sliver of moon. Guests had come and gone throughout the day, for Sir Alister Bramwell's annual autumn gathering was something of a tradition, though the man himself was not universally admired. He was a figure of contradictions, generous in his donations to the parish, yet cruel in his business dealings, warm in company, yet known to harbour a bitter, suspicious temper. That evening, though, his drawing-room had been lit with firelight and laughter, and the guests had sipped port while the rain traced long rivulets down the windows. The laughter did not last the night. When the butler, Dawson, discovered Sir Bramwell slumped in his chair past midnight, the room still smelling faintly of cigar smoke, there was no mistaking it. His master was dead. His face bore an odd rigidity, his lips stained with a faint discoloration, as though some ghastly poison had found its way past them. And yet the scene presented a puzzle. A single cigar, half burned, lay fallen on the rug, smouldering dangerously close to the hearth. An ornate box of them sat open on the side table, none appearing disturbed save the one he had smoked. On the desk, scattered papers told of a day spent in business, nothing incriminating or even unfinished. The local physician, summoned in haste, muttered something about a seizure, though the discoloration on the lips gave him pause. The body bore no wounds, no glass lay overturned to suggest poison in drink, and there was no sign of struggle. The windows had been latched from within, the door locked by Dawson himself after delivering the last of the brandy. How then had death crept in to claim him, unseen? It was Lady Bramwell, pale and trembling, who insisted that the authorities be called. Yet the inspector who arrived from the nearby market town admitted privately that the case was beyond him. He had seen shootings, knifings, even poisonings. But this, a man dead in a locked room, with nothing but a cigar to tie his end together. By morning the house had grown hushed, the grand rooms weighed down with fear. Guests had been asked to remain, for each was now a potential witness, if not a suspect. Among them was an unassuming elderly lady, small in stature, with eyes that missed nothing, and hands that folded neatly in her lap, as if they had all the time in the world. Miss Jane Marple had not been an intended guest. Rather, she had been staying with her old school friend Mrs. Whitcomb, who lived in the village and had been invited for supper. Circumstance had led her here, and now fate seemed determined to keep her. What Miss Marple noted first was not the body nor the cigar, but the atmosphere. Fear is a curious thing, she always thought. It leaves marks as surely as a muddy boot on a clean floor. Sir Bramwell's widow avoided glancing at the cigar box, though her eyes flicked to it when she thought herself unwatched. The young secretary, Mr. Alton, hovered near the door as though hoping to escape at the earliest chance. Dawson the butler was steadfast and stiff, yet his hands shook when he poured tea, and the physician, who ought to have projected calm authority, seemed more concerned with washing his hands again and again, as though something upon them troubled him. The inspector had little to go on. Poison, perhaps, but if so, how administered? The brandy had been tested, untouched. His supper, eaten hours before, had been shared with several others. No glass, no vial, no cup bore a trace. Only the cigar remained, an object too ordinary to command suspicion, and yet its presence was too striking to ignore. It was Miss Marple who finally voiced the thought others feared to say aloud. "You see, Inspector, it would be quite the simplest thing in the world. A man lights his evening cigar, quite unaware that it has been treated. A clever hand may alter even such a common article into a deadly weapon." The inspector frowned. "And yet, madam, if that were so, why only one? A box full of cigars, yet he takes the single one that is poisoned. That would be the devil's luck." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Or not luck at all." The idea unsettled the company, for it hinted not at chance, but at intent. Someone had meant for Sir Bramwell to smoke that very cigar, the one now nothing more than ash on the rug. As the night wore into day, the story of Sir Bramwell's last hours was pieced together. He had retired to his study after dinner, bidding good night to his guests, though Dawson had been asked to bring a decanter of brandy later. No one else claimed to have entered after that point. The windows, heavy with rain, had been locked, and the key to the study door rested even now in Dawson's pocket, as it always had. The man swore on his life that none had passed through without his knowledge, and so the contradictions mounted: a death by poison with no vessel, a locked room with no intruder, a box of cigars, all harmless but one. If the cigar was indeed the instrument, then the murderer had not only prepared it, but also contrived to ensure Sir Bramwell would select it, and no other. Miss Marple said little, only watching, noting, storing away every expression and hesitation. Her experience of human nature, honed through years of village gossip, quiet observation, and a sharp mind, told her that somewhere in the house lay the answer, quiet as a whisper, but as inevitable as dawn. For people, she often mused, are not so clever as they imagine. They always leave a thread dangling, and it only requires a steady hand to tug until the whole tapestry unravels. Sir Bramwell had many enemies, many debts, many quarrels, but whoever had done this had not merely sought his death, they had staged it with precision, sealing the room and planting the seed of a mystery that might never be solved, or at least not solved by ordinary means. Miss Marple folded her hands a little tighter in her lap and glanced once more at the cigar box. It seemed such a trivial object, and yet within it lay the heart of the matter, she felt certain. The cursed cigar, the one chosen from many, had carried a secret, and somewhere in the great uneasy house the hand that placed it waited still. The morning light did little to soften the unease that hung over St. Audley's Manor. Rain still clung to the windows, streaking the glass as though nature itself conspired to keep the house cloaked in gloom. The inspector had taken charge in his brusque, official way, gathering statements, pacing the study, and ordering Dawson to ensure that no one left. Yet it was plain to Miss Marple that for all his activity, he was no closer to the truth. He was like a fisherman thrashing in water too deep, mistaking movement for progress. She sat quietly in the drawing-room with the others, knitting in her lap, though she scarcely moved the needles. It was her way to appear absorbed in something simple, while her mind gathered threads from every word, every glance. The inspector's questions rolled over the company like waves, yet it was not their answers that intrigued her most, but the little hesitations, the quick darting of eyes. Human nature, she reflected, could never quite hide itself when pressed. When Dawson was asked to recount the night, he did so with solemn precision. He had served brandy at 10:30, seen his master light a cigar, and then, at Sir Bramwell's request, locked the door behind him, keeping the key as was his custom. "No one entered after that, sir, I swear it upon my honour." His voice wavered, though whether from fear or guilt Miss Marple could not yet say. The widow, pale and draped in black silk, though the undertaker had not yet been, sat stiffly by the fire. Her grief seemed oddly restrained, her hands folded so tightly that the knuckles blanched. "Alistair had enemies," she murmured when pressed. "I cannot name them, but they were many. In business, in politics. I always feared—" She trailed off, her gaze flicking, ever so briefly, to the cigar box upon the inspector's desk. Miss Marple caught it. Such tiny betrayals, unguarded in moments of strain, often told more than a torrent of words. The young secretary, Mr. Alton, looked the very image of nerves, wringing his hands and smoothing his hair. He admitted that Sir Bramwell had quarrelled with him that afternoon over a set of misfiled contracts. But it was nothing, truly, he protested, his eyes too wide. Sir Alistair he was always sharp with me, but I never wished him ill. The poor boy trembled, and Miss Marple pitied him, though pity and suspicion are not mutually exclusive. The physician was the last to speak. Dr. Harwood had been called from his nearby home, arriving to find the body already cold. His manner was brisk, but there was a curious edge to it, a touch of defensiveness. He dismissed poison in the drink, pointed to the discoloration of the lips, and declared the matter most unusual indeed. "A seizure is still possible," he insisted, "though, yes, the marks are peculiar." And then he spoke of how he had known Sir Bramwell for years, often treating him for ailments of digestion and nerves, which he implied were partly brought on by an excess of cigars and port. The man was not well, he concluded firmly. It may be that death came quite naturally, despite the odd appearance. It was then that Miss Marple's eyes, resting innocently on her knitting, strayed once more to the cigar box. Something in its placement tugged at her mind. It sat open upon the desk, the cigars arranged with neat precision. And yet, yes, there it was, a tiny irregularity, visible only to one accustomed to neatness in small things. The rows were perfect, all facing the same way, save for one slot, now empty, where the alignment had been just slightly different. The rest of the cigars pointed uniformly, but that single missing one had lain at a contrary angle. She said nothing at first, for the inspector was still blustering on about fingerprints and the impossibility of anyone entering the room unseen. Instead, she looked at Lady Bramwell, who had been watching the box with a quiet dread, and then at the secretary, who avoided looking at it at all. These things she stored away like scraps of thread to be woven later. When the company was at last dismissed, the inspector setting guards at the doors, Miss Marple lingered in the study. The inspector indulged her, perhaps thinking her a harmless old lady. She peered at the rug, where the ash of the fatal cigar lay. It had burned oddly, unevenly, as though the tobacco within had been altered. She bent close and saw a faint, crystalline glimmer among the blackened ash, barely visible to the eye. That was interesting indeed. As she straightened, she noticed something else, a small matchbook tucked behind a stack of ledgers on the desk. Not the usual heavy matches Sir Bramwell kept in a silver case, but a cheap paper book, the sort given away at taverns or hotels. Strange that it should be here, hidden rather than left in plain sight. She touched it lightly with her fingers, but did not disturb it, for she had no wish to alert the inspector yet. Instead, she filed it away in her mind as yet another loose thread. Later, when the household gathered uneasily for breakfast, Miss Marple sat between Mrs. Whitcomb and Lady Bramwell. Conversation faltered, for every word seemed suspect now. It was then that she made her first gentle probe. "Sir Alistair was most particular about his cigars, was he not?" she asked mildly, as though it were a matter of idle curiosity. The secretary started, nearly spilling his tea. Yes, very particular. He had them imported specially. No one but Dawson was allowed to touch the box. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, nodding. "And yet one wonders, was he equally particular about which cigar he chose each night? Or might he have taken whichever lay nearest to hand?" Lady Bramwell's spoon clattered softly against her saucer. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" she demanded, a little too sharply. "Oh, nothing at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied with her most innocent smile. "Only that habits can tell us much. One man chooses at random, another follows the same ritual night after night. It is curious how very revealing such little routines can be." The widow said no more, but her lips tightened. The secretary, by contrast, seemed almost relieved, as though grateful the question had not been turned more directly upon him. Dawson, silent at the sideboard, glanced once toward the cigar box, and then away, his jaw set. Miss Marple knew then that the deception had already begun to show itself. Someone here knew far more than they had admitted, and their fear betrayed them. The poisoned cigar had not been a matter of chance. It had been placed, chosen, insured. The matchbook, the uneven row in the box, the reactions at breakfast, each was a fragment, not yet whole, but together forming the edges of a picture that would, in time, reveal itself. She smiled faintly into her teacup, as though pleased with nothing more than the flavour of the brew. But inside, her mind turned steadily, patiently, for she had seen the first cracks in the facade, and once a crack appears, it always widens. The drawing-room at St. Audley's Manor had been converted into a kind of makeshift courtroom. The inspector, stern and restless, paced before the hearth while the household sat in strained silence waiting to be called upon. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner with her knitting, appeared the least imposing figure in the room, yet her watchful eyes absorbed more than any of them knew. The questioning began with Dawson, the butler. He stood tall, his back rigid, and recounted for the third time how he had brought the brandy at 10:30, how Sir Bramwell had dismissed him with a gruff wave, and how he had locked the study door behind him as instructed. "It was my duty, sir. The master always preferred the study secured at night, especially when he worked late. I kept the key, as I always did. None entered afterward, I swear." The inspector pressed him. "And you never left the key unattended? Not for a moment?" "Never, sir. It is on my person even now." Dawson produced it with a flourish, as though the solid metal might defend his honour. Yet Miss Marple noted how tightly his fingers clutched it, as though he feared it might be taken from him. When asked about the cigars, Dawson hesitated, just slightly. "The master kept his own supply, sir. I was not permitted to touch them." "Not even to arrange them in their box?" "No, sir," Dawson said firmly, though his gaze flickered, betraying perhaps that this was not entirely true. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She filed that flicker away in her mind. Next came Lady Bramwell. She glided to the chair set before the inspector with an air of dignity that did not quite mask the tremor of her hands. Her grief was carefully arranged, like her mourning attire, convincing at first glance, yet strangely brittle beneath. "My husband had enemies," she began, her voice low and steady. "In business, he was ruthless. In politics, uncompromising. I always feared one day it would catch up with him. I cannot tell you who, but there are many who might have wished him harm." The inspector leaned forward. "Did Sir Bramwell seem troubled that evening? Did he mention any threats?" She shook her head. "No more than usual. He dined with us, retired to his study, and I never saw him again alive." Her eyes lowered as she spoke, and though her words rang true, Miss Marple caught a detail others missed. Her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her rings pressed deep into her skin. This was not the gesture of a woman overcome by grief, but of one struggling against fear or guilt. When asked about the cigars, Lady Bramwell faltered. He always chose one at random. I paid little heed. He smoked too many, if you ask me." "Random?" Miss Marple echoed softly from her corner. Lady Bramwell's eyes snapped toward her, startled. "Yes, random," she said quickly. Too quickly. The inspector moved on, perhaps not noticing, but Miss Marple let the word turn over in her mind. She suspected Sir Bramwell was not the sort of man to leave his pleasures to chance. The secretary, Mr. Alton, was next. He looked pale, drawn, his collar too tight around his throat. "Sir Bramwell was angry with me that afternoon," he admitted in a rush. "But it was over a trifle, I swear. A set of contracts mislaid. He shouted, as he often did, but I bore him no malice." "You were the last to see him before Dawson brought the brandy, is that correct?" "Yes. I left the study at 9:30. He dismissed me then. He was calmer by that time." The inspector asked if he had seen the cigars. "Of course," Alton replied. "He always smoked one in the evenings. He had a peculiar ritual about it. He would tap the box, turn it slightly, then take whichever cigar lay nearest the front." Miss Marple looked up at that. A ritual. Not random, as Lady Bramwell claimed. A small contradiction, yet telling, for habits revealed truth and lies often stumbled over such little details. The physician, Dr. Harwood, was called last. He entered with a briskness that seemed designed to project confidence, yet his eyes darted as he spoke. "Sir Bramwell was not in good health," he declared. "His heart was weak, his nerves strained. A sudden seizure is entirely possible. The discoloration of the lips, while peculiar, is not definitive proof of poison." The inspector frowned. "And yet the cigar seems the likeliest." "Cause?" Harwood shifted. "Perhaps, but I would not rush to judgment. These matters are seldom so simple." Miss Marple's quiet voice drifted across the room. "You were very quick to wash your hands after examining the body, Doctor. Was it because you feared some substance might linger there?" The room stilled. Harwood stiffened. "A physician is always cautious," he snapped. "It is second nature. I meant nothing by it." But Miss Marple had seen the flush rise in his cheeks. She smiled politely and returned to her knitting, saying no more. The seed of doubt had been planted, and in time it would bear fruit. When the questioning ended, the inspector seemed no closer to resolution. Each account overlapped, yet contradictions threaded through them like cracks in glass. Dawson swore he never touched the cigars, though his hesitation betrayed him. Lady Bramwell claimed her husband chose at random, while the secretary described a fixed ritual. The doctor dismissed poison, though his hands told another story. Miss Marple sat in silence as the others dispersed, her eyes half closed, as though dozing. But her mind was alight. Deception, she knew, was never perfect. It left its fingerprints in small, careless details, and here she had seen them: the clenched hands, the nervous starts, the conflicting tales of a cigar habit. Someone in this house had woven a web of lies, but already the threads were beginning to unravel. She thought of the matchbook tucked behind the ledgers, of the misaligned cigar in its box, of the crystalline glimmer in the ash. Each was a clue, quiet but persistent, and together they whispered of a hand that had planned carefully, only to stumble in the telling afterward. As she rose from her chair, her knitting folded neatly in her basket, Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest smile. The truth was there, concealed in shadows and contradictions. All she need do was listen a little longer, for voices of deception always revealed themselves in the end. The rain had lessened by afternoon, though the sky remained the colour of tarnished pewter. St. Audley's Manor stood as though weighted with the storm that had passed, its walls heavy with silence, its corridors tense with whispers. Sir Bramwell's body had been removed to the village, but his presence lingered, a restless shadow in every room. The inspector busied himself with routine procedures, scribbling notes, issuing orders, yet the mystery remained stubborn, like a knot that would not loosen. Miss Marple, in her quiet corner, knew that knots required patience. They had to be teased apart thread by thread, each strand considered in turn. And here there were many threads, motives, grudges, fears, all entangled about Sir Bramwell's death. Greed was the most obvious. Sir Bramwell's wealth was considerable, and his will, though not yet read, was common knowledge in its general outline. Lady Bramwell stood to inherit the estate, though whispers in the village had long suggested their marriage was not a happy one. There had been rumours of coldness, of sharp words behind closed doors. A widow, especially a youngish one with her looks still intact, might find freedom a tempting prospect, particularly if that freedom came gilded with fortune. Yet greed was not hers alone. Mr. Alton, the secretary, was a man dependent on Sir Bramwell's favour. A single dismissal would have left him destitute. Had he grown desperate, fearing the quarrel that afternoon would see him turned out? Desperation, Miss Marple knew, could drive even the meekest creatures to startling acts. Then there was Dawson, the butler. His loyalty appeared rigid, yet loyalty can sour into resentment. Miss Marple had caught the faint bitterness in his tone when he spoke of Sir Bramwell's commands. He had served long years under a master who demanded much and praised little, and it had not escaped her notice that Dawson knew far more of the cigars than he admitted. If he resented his place, if he dreamed of release or even some form of justice, might he not have found means to deliver it? Revenge, too, played its part. Sir Bramwell had enemies aplenty in business. Though none of those men were present in the house, revenge does not always wear the face of the injured party. A message can be delivered through the hand of another, through bribery or coercion. Perhaps someone within these walls had acted as the agent of another's malice. Jealousy also lurked in the air, faint but real. Miss Marple had observed over supper the night before the way Lady Bramwell's eyes had strayed toward the young secretary, not boldly, but in those small betraying glances that women are seldom aware they make. And Mr. Alton, for his part, had flushed when she addressed him, his voice softening. If there had been an attachment, unspoken yet simmering, Sir Bramwell's death might clear the way for it. Jealousy, that most ancient of motives, could not be discounted. And finally there was fear. Fear often drives people into rashness. Sir Bramwell was a man who knew secrets, business secrets, political secrets, even personal ones. Miss Marple had learned long ago that in every village, however genteel, there were scandals waiting beneath the surface. Perhaps one of his household feared exposure. Perhaps the fatal cigar was not only a weapon but a silencing act. As she sorted these motives in her mind, she began to fit them against the facts. Each person had reason, yet no single motive explained the peculiar care taken in the murder: the locked room, the poisoned cigar, the concealment of the matchbook. Such elaborate design suggested not only intent but planning. It was not a crime of sudden passion, nor one committed by an ignorant hand. She considered Dawson first. He had the opportunity, certainly, access to the study, possession of the key, and he might easily have tampered with the cigars. Yet his demeanour, though stiff, carried more fear than malice. He clutched at his honour like a shield. If guilty, Would he not try harder to appear calm? Unless, of course, his fear was not of exposure but of something else, something he knew and dared not speak. Lady Bramwell, on the other hand, seemed curiously rehearsed. Her grief struck Miss Marple as too careful, like a mask worn too long. Her contradiction about Sir Bramwell's cigar habits weighed heavily. Why claim randomness if she knew of his ritual? Unless she wished to obscure the fact that someone had used that ritual to predict his choice. That suggested knowledge, and knowledge was perilous. Mr. Alton's nervousness was genuine enough, but his contradiction was the most telling. He had spoken of the ritual without hesitation, as though it were second nature to him, yet Lady Bramwell had denied it. One told the truth, the other a lie. Which was which? Miss Marple suspected Alton's account was the more accurate. The detail of tapping the box and taking the front cigar bore the ring of lived observation. And Dr. Harwood, his insistence on natural causes seemed almost desperate. If poison were proved, it would expose him as either incompetent or complicit. His defensiveness, his quickness to wash his hands, his eagerness to declare the matter inconclusive, these pointed to a man concealing something, whether guilt or negligence remained to be seen. Miss Marple let her knitting rest and looked out the window at the sodden lawns. She thought of the matchbook again, its cheap paper cover out of place among Sir Bramwell's silver and mahogany. Who had placed it there, and why hidden? A careless slip or an object of meaning? Such details often held the key, though one had to be patient enough to wait for their significance to emerge. By evening the inspector had grown weary of chasing shadows. He spoke of calling in experts from London, of chemical analysis and fingerprinting. Miss Marple, however, knew that no laboratory could reveal what lay in human hearts. Motive was the true map of murder, and only by tracing its winding paths could one reach the centre. She found herself in quiet conversation with Dawson by the pantry door. "You must have known Sir Bramwell better than most," she said kindly. The butler's face softened just for a moment. "He was a hard man, miss, hard on himself and harder on others. But I served him faithfully." His voice lowered. "Though, I will say this, he had a temper and a sharp tongue. He knew how to wound with words. Sometimes I thought he enjoyed it." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Words can be crueler than deeds." Later, she spoke with the secretary, who lingered in the library. "You must have been very useful to Sir Bramwell, Mr. Alton. He relied on you, did he not?" Alton flushed. I tried to please him, but he was impossible. Nothing I did was ever enough." His hands twisted together. "And he threatened me yesterday, Miss Marple. He said he would ruin me. That he would see me dismissed and disgraced." "Ah," said Miss Marple gently. "That would frighten a young man, I'm sure." Each confession, each whispered truth added to the maze of motives. Greed, revenge, jealousy, fear, they all wound about Sir Bramwell's death like ivy choking a wall. Yet the web was too tangled still. The murderous thread ran through it, but which strand was it? As night fell again over the manor, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, her knitting set aside. The inspector believed he was at a standstill, that the case grew murkier with each word. But Miss Marple knew differently. Complexity was only an illusion. In the end, one thread always ran straight, if one had the patience to follow it, and she had already seen the beginnings of that thread, glimmering faintly among the contradictions. By the following morning, the manor hummed with a brittle kind of energy, like a stage waiting for its final act. The inspector, weary yet eager to show progress, had summoned everyone once more into the drawing-room. A sense of anticipation clung to the air, sharpened by fatigue and suspicion. Each guest and servant bore the marks of sleepless hours, pale faces, reddened eyes, voices strained to quietness. Miss Marple, however, looked as placid as ever, her knitting needles clicking faintly in the corner. She was not deceived by the inspector's renewed vigour. He had found something, she could tell, and he meant to make a show of it. But the little frown lines at his brow told her that his evidence was not as watertight as he wished it to be. The revelation came swiftly. "Last night," the inspector declared, his voice heavy with the weight of triumph, a search of Sir Bramwell's study uncovered a vital clue. This. He held aloft the cheap paper matchbook that Miss Marple had already noted behind the ledgers. The cover was creased and faintly stained. the printed name of a modest inn from the nearby market town visible in faded ink. Neither Sir Bramwell nor his household would have frequented such a place, the inspector continued. The matches must have been brought in by another, by someone who sought to conceal them, and on this matchbook we have found a fingerprint. He paused for effect. The fingerprint belongs to Mr. Alton. A sharp intake of breath rippled across the room. The secretary turned ashen, his lips parting soundlessly. That is impossible, he stammered. I have never seen it before in my life. The inspector pressed on relentlessly. You alone had access to Sir Bramwell in the hour before his death. You quarrelled with him that very afternoon. We now know he threatened to ruin you, and in fear of dismissal you sought to act. You tampered with his cigars, prepared one with poison, and left the incriminating matches behind. Alton's protests came in a rush, his words tripping over one another. No, I admit he quarrelled with me, but I would never harm him. He was cruel, yes, but I needed his employment. Why would I leave matches behind to betray myself? It makes no sense. Criminals are often careless in their arrogance, the inspector said. He turned to the widow, whose expression was composed, but curiously unreadable. Madam, justice will be served. We have our culprit. Miss Marple watched the scene unfold, her eyes on the young man's trembling hands, his pale, desperate face. She saw something else, too, the quick tightening of Lady Bramwell's lips, the way Dawson's gaze flicked once toward the cigar box and away again, and the faintest twitch in Dr. Harwood's jaw, as though he fought to keep his composure. She cleared her throat softly. If I may, Inspector. He looked at her with mild irritation, the way men of authority so often did when challenged by an elderly woman. Yes, Miss Marple? She folded her hands neatly in her lap. I quite understand why you believe you have found your culprit. A fingerprint seems damning, does it not? And yet, she tilted her head, I cannot help but feel it is rather too neat. The inspector bristled. Too neat? Yes, indeed. For if Mr. Alton were clever enough to contrive so delicate a murder as to poison a cigar, ensuring Sir Bramwell would choose it, and in a locked room no less, would he then be foolish enough to leave behind such an obvious clue as a matchbook bearing his fingerprint? Alton looked at her with something like gratitude, though fear still choked him. Yes, exactly. The inspector hesitated, but pride carried him forward. It was hidden. That alone suggests guilt. Or, Miss Marple said gently, it suggests it was meant to be found. Planted, as it were. Consider, Inspector, if Sir Bramwell had a ritual of choosing his cigar, then whoever poisoned it must have known that ritual. How many in this household were close enough to observe such a thing? The inspector faltered. Why, the secretary, of course. And Lady Bramwell, Miss Marple added softly. A wife sees her husband's habits. The butler, too, in his service. Even the doctor in his visits might have observed such details. Yet only one man's fingerprint appears on the matchbook. How very convenient. Her words hung in the air. The inspector's jaw tightened, but his triumph dimmed. Still, procedure demanded action, and Alton was escorted away to await formal custody. The young man's protests echoed down the corridor until the heavy door closed behind him. The household dispersed uneasily afterward. Lady Bramwell excused herself with a hand pressed to her brow. Dawson retreated to his duties in silence. Dr. Harwood lingered only long enough to remark, a tragic business, but I dare say justice must be seen to be done before slipping away. Left alone, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting basket. She had seen enough in her years to know when a case was truly solved and when it was merely made to appear so. The matchbook, the fingerprint, the inspector's eagerness, all of it felt like a play staged for effect. She could almost hear Sir Bramwell's voice in the shadows, sharp and mocking, daring them to look deeper. She reflected upon the motives she had already traced. Greed in the widow, desperation in the secretary, resentment in the butler, fear in the doctor. Any of them might have sought Sir Bramwell's end, but which of them was subtle enough to weave deception into the very fabric of the investigation, to plant evidence, to turn suspicion upon another, to stand by with hands folded while an innocent man bore the blame? Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the faint rhythm of the needles keeping time with her thoughts. No, she was not convinced. Justice had not yet been served. The true hand remained in shadow, clever and patient, waiting for the dust to settle. But she too was patient. She had learned in the small dramas of village life that the truth always comes out sooner or later. People cannot help themselves. They lie, they falter, they reveal more than they intend. Her eyes strayed once more to the cigar box. The key to everything lay there, she was certain. Not in fingerprints or planted matchbooks, but in the simple truth of human habit. Sir Bramwell had tapped the box, turned it, and chosen from the front. Someone had known this. Someone had counted upon it. And until that thread was followed to its end, Miss Marple would not rest. For now, however, she let the inspector bask in his false victory. It was often useful to let men believe the matter closed. The real criminal, after all, would relax their guard. And when they did, Jane Marple would be waiting. The false triumph of the inspector had left St. Audley's Manor in a tense lull. The household moved quietly, uncertain, as though the very walls of the house held their breath. Miss Marple, however, felt no such uncertainty. The threads of the case, previously tangled, had begun to show a subtle pattern, one only visible to someone accustomed to the faintest tremors in human behaviour. She wandered alone through the dim hallways, her eyes lingering on details the others ignored. The manor itself held secrets, and old houses often remembered what their owners sought to forget. She paused before a tall bookcase in the library, running her fingers along the spines. Many of the volumes were dull, worn with age, but one caught her attention, a leather-bound ledger with the name Bramwell stamped in gold. She opened it, not expecting much, but a folded sheet of paper fell out and fluttered to the floor. Picking it up, she saw a faint, almost illegible note, a name, a date, and a brief account of a financial dispute settled quietly years ago. Curiosity piqued, she examined it more closely. The date was 15 years past. The name, she recognized immediately, belonged to a man whose daughter now worked as Lady Bramwell's companion, a young woman named Miss Ethel Whitcomb. Miss Marple's mind stirred with recollection. A scandal at the old Market Town Bank, a small embezzlement that had been quietly hushed up, one that had left reputations bruised but intact. It had involved Sir Bramwell, of course, who had been a young lawyer then, known for his sharpness and unsparing judgment. The affair had ended quietly, but old grudges often festered in silence. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she considered the connection. Lady Bramwell's companion, the young Miss Whitcomb, had entered the household long after the marriage, yet her family's history intersected with Sir Bramwell's past, in ways the household would never suspect. She began to see a lattice forming, past grievances woven into present opportunity. Dawson, loyal but long-serving, had witnessed Sir Bramwell's dealings and carried his own memories, some perhaps bitter. Dr. Harwood had tended the household for decades, and might have known more of these past entanglements than anyone suspected. The realization struck her quietly but firmly. The crime was not merely a matter of current envy or greed. It had roots buried deep, nourished by old resentment, long-forgotten humiliation, and careful planning. The present suspects were all actors on a stage set by events from years ago, and someone had seized upon that history to orchestrate murder with precision. She returned to the drawing-room where Lady Bramwell and the remaining household sat, each uneasy under the inspector's watchful eye. Miss Marple chose her words with care, knowing she must reveal enough to stir observation, but not yet expose the whole. "Have you ever noticed," she said softly, "that events of long ago can shape our actions more than we care to admit? People hold grudges quietly, and sometimes those grudges lie dormant until circumstance awakens them." Lady Bramwell's eyes flickered. Dawson's face tightened. Dr. Harwood's hands clenched the armrest. Even the young companions looked up, startled by the weight in Miss Marple's words. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" the widow asked, her voice steady but faintly guarded. "Only that the past is rarely truly gone," Miss Marple said, keeping her tone gentle. "It leaves traces, notes, memories, habits, even small errors in judgment. And sometimes it teaches a careful mind where to strike. One might look at a young man, a secretary perhaps, and think him desperate. But might he also be unwittingly entangled in old disputes, guided by those who remember and resent? Dawson stirred in his chair, and Miss Marple caught the subtle twitch of recognition in his eye. He had been part of the household then, a witness to more than the present case. Dr. Harwood, too, gave a flicker of something, disturbance, perhaps, or the first hint of fear. Miss Marple rose, moving toward the hearth, fingering a small silver cigarette case that lay beside the chair where Sir Bramwell had last sat. The case was ordinary, yet she noted an engraving, initials that did not belong to Sir Bramwell, though the style matched the house's period of renovation. She had seen such personalisation in other cases, often a silent claim, a reminder of a prior owner, or a discreet gift tied to memory. It suggested an intimate awareness of household routine, knowledge of a man's habits, and perhaps a link between past and present actors in the drama. Her thoughts returned to the ledger and the note she had discovered. If Sir Bramwell had once wronged someone, however legally or justly that person, or someone acting for them, might now have motive, carefully disguised beneath layers of apparent loyalty, fear, and respectability. And that could explain why the crime had been so elegantly staged. The killer knew not only Sir Bramwell's habits, but the household's routines, the reactions of each member, and how suspicion would be cast. By late afternoon she began quietly questioning the household again, not in the inspector's formal manner, but in gentle, casual conversation. "Dawson, you've served many masters," she said, her voice light. "Have you ever seen how grudges held for years sometimes surface at the most unexpected moments?" The butler stiffened, a small, imperceptible nod betraying acknowledgement. Miss Marple knew he was old enough to have remembered the long-ago scandal, and that he knew who had been involved. Lady Bramwell, when asked about the companion, shifted uncomfortably. "Ethel? She is trustworthy. I do not know what you mean." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course, my dear. Trust is often a fragile thing, yet one must admit that old affairs sometimes echo into new generations." Even Dr. Harwood could not conceal a momentary tightening of the mouth. Past knowledge of the household, careful observation, intimate access. These were tools of a criminal who could manipulate the present using the past as a guide. By nightfall, Miss Marple had pieced together a rough outline. The murder was not an impulsive act of current frustration or greed alone. It had been planned with knowledge of Sir Bramwell's routines, his habits, and the house itself. Old grievances provided the motive, but only careful observation, knowledge, and the right opportunity allowed the killer to execute the plan flawlessly. The matchbook, the fingerprint, the apparent quarrel, each was a calculated distraction, meant to mislead, to present an innocent hand as guilty, while the true architect of the murder lingered unnoticed. Sitting quietly by the fire, Miss Marple reflected on the hidden connections she had discovered. The threads of past and present, woven tightly together, formed a lattice that, once understood, revealed the edges of the criminal mind. Greed, jealousy, and fear were merely the surface. Underneath lay the invisible hand of history, guiding the acts of the present. The inspector might declare the case solved with the arrest of Mr. Alton, but Miss Marple knew better. The true criminal remained in the shadows, waiting for the confusion of the false victory to settle before moving forward. Yet with patience, observation, and the faintest touch of memory, she would uncover the link between past grievances and present crimes, and bring the hidden architect of Sir Bramwell's death into the light. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the human mind, when pressed gently, often revealed far more than force or intimidation ever could. The household at St. Audley's Manor was tense from the previous day's false triumph, the arrest of Mr. Alton leaving a heavy air of unease. People moved as though measured by invisible strings, each gesture and glance carefully calculated. But strings, once tugged in the right way, could snap. She began by observing them individually, asking casual, innocuous questions that seemed of little consequence. "Dawson," she inquired one morning, "did Sir Bramwell ever favour one cigar over another? Perhaps on evenings when he had a visitor, or after a particularly long day?" The butler's lips pressed into a thin line. "He chose according to habit, miss, that is all I know." Miss Marple nodded, but did not press. She was not after confession, but for small slips of behaviour, slight inconsistencies in memory or reaction that might reveal more than words themselves. Later, she turned her attention to Lady Bramwell. "You know, my dear," she said softly, "a man's habits are often reflected in little things, overlooked by strangers but remembered by those close to him. Some of us are aware of these habits without realizing it. Have you ever noticed a particular ritual in a husband or father, perhaps?" Lady Bramwell's fingers clenched the edge of her chair. Well, yes, but it is hardly relevant." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, folding her hands. "And yet sometimes what seems irrelevant is the very key to understanding another's behaviour. Small habits can betray even the most careful planning." She decided it was time to employ a more unconventional tactic. She took from her basket a few ordinary household objects, a fresh cigar from the untouched supply, a small silver matchbox, and a blank sheet of paper. Nothing seemed remarkable, yet to those under observation, the appearance of these objects might prompt subtle responses. She invited Lady Bramwell to join her by the fireplace, under the pretext of arranging the cigars. "It is curious," Miss Marple remarked, "how a simple item, like a cigar, can carry so much history, so much knowledge. One might believe they are harmless, yet they may reveal intent or even guilt." Lady Bramwell's hands fluttered near the cigar box, almost touching it, then retreated. Miss Marple noted the hesitation. "Do you recall, my dear, how Sir Bramwell chose these? Front or back? Tap or twist?" The widow's face paled. He did have habits. Everyone knew it," she said, her voice tight. "And habits," Miss Marple continued, "are often what a careful person exploits when planning a crime. Knowledge of such habits, whether old or recent, can be as dangerous as a weapon." She tapped the cigar lightly, then placed it on the silver tray. "Yet the right observer can sometimes see through the mask. People often respond in ways that give themselves away, even without intending to." Dawson, who had entered quietly to refill the teapot, froze at the words. Miss Marple's eyes caught a subtle shift. His hand lingered on the tray just slightly longer than necessary, as though assessing whether to intervene. It was Dr. Harwood, however, whose reaction gave the clearest sign of hidden tension. When Miss Marple retrieved the blank sheet of paper and placed it near the silver case, he flinched almost imperceptibly. She asked casually, "Do you think one could leave a note here, hidden from sight, yet readable to someone who knew exactly where to look?" Dr. Harwood's jaw tightened. "I suppose, yes, that is possible," he said quickly, avoiding her gaze. Miss Marple smiled ever so slightly. "And the person who does such a thing must know the household intimately, must they not? Not merely the habits of one individual, but the movements of those around him, the timing, the routines. Otherwise, the act is far too risky." The doctor nodded stiffly, but the lines around his eyes deepened, betraying discomfort. Miss Marple had seen the flicker of recognition, the first tiny crack in a carefully maintained facade. To test her intuition further, she conducted a small, seemingly trivial experiment. She asked Dawson to prepare tea for the household, observing carefully who lingered near the study and who did not. The butler followed her instructions methodically, yet his eyes strayed repeatedly toward the cigar box, as though he expected or feared something. Lady Bramwell avoided the room entirely, her movements deliberate but tense. Dr. Harwood lingered near the entrance, checking each corner with the sort of attention one might use to hide a guilty glance. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, sorting the reactions like pieces of a puzzle. The flinches, the hesitations, the subtle avoidance, they were small, almost invisible to the casual observer, but meaningful to one who knew what to look for. The matchbook and the cigars, placed again in their usual positions, acted as silent provocations, each object drawing out a response from someone who had reason to worry. Finally, Miss Marple decided to speak more pointedly, without accusing, merely observing. A crime planned with knowledge of habits, observed and executed with care, requires patience. Yet even the most patient can falter when confronted with the familiar. A glance at a known object, a simple gesture, can betray intent without a word spoken. Dr. Harwood's hand twitched almost imperceptibly. Lady Bramwell's lips pressed, tightly, as though biting back a thought. Dawson's gaze shifted rapidly between the detective and the silver case. Miss Marple, knitting once more, allowed herself a faint smile. The psychological test had worked. People revealed themselves, even when convinced they remained hidden. She did not speak further, but her mind had collected enough to begin weaving the web. Someone in that household knew the habits, the patterns, and the hidden roots of influence. Their reactions to ordinary objects, the cigar, the matchbox, even a blank sheet of paper, had given away a subtle crack in their deception. Miss Marple leaned back, allowing the threads to settle in her mind. Patience and quiet observation, the careful orchestration of small provocations, were often more revealing than interrogation or formal procedure. One slip, one hesitation, and the truth would emerge. Outside, the light waned and shadows crept across the manor's walls. Inside, secrets trembled under gentle pressure. Miss Marple had begun to see the outline of the murderer, hidden still in plain sight, careful yet flawed. The unconventional clue had done its work. A minor, everyday object had exposed an imperfection in the carefully constructed facade. Tomorrow she would press further, watching who could not resist the lure of habit and who faltered in the presence of what they believed harmless. The crack was small, but it was there, and once widened, it would let the light of truth pour into the shadowed corners of St. Audley's Manor. The manor was unusually still the following morning. The usual clatter of servants moving about, of doors opening and closing, had been replaced by a taut silence, each footstep measured, each glance cautious. Even the inspector seemed uneasy, as though sensing that the tidy progress of the previous day was about to unravel. Miss Marple, knitting in her usual corner of the drawing-room, felt the shift immediately. Something had changed overnight. It was subtle, a faint disturbance in the routine, the way Dawson lingered a moment too long at the sideboard, the way Lady Bramwell's gaze darted toward the study, and the slight tension in Dr. Harwood's posture as he entered for his morning call. All were small, yet to Miss Marple these minute variations spoke volumes. Her attention was drawn to the study where the poisoned cigar and matchbook had been carefully examined and documented the day before. She rose quietly, intending to review the scene herself, tracing the habits of the household and confirming what she already suspected, that someone had intimate knowledge of the crime and the evidence surrounding it. But when she opened the study door, her heart sank slightly. The silver case that had held the crucial cigar, the matchbook, and the ledger with the folded note, the very items she had intended to examine, were gone. The place had been disturbed. The papers and objects that remained were disarranged. A single chair was pushed. Askew, a drawer left slightly open. Someone had been there, and not merely to look. She felt the familiar stirrings of both frustration and clarity. Whoever had taken the evidence knew its significance. Whoever had acted had either inside knowledge of the manor or bold audacity to risk being caught. The theft was calculated, deliberate, a shield against the mounting pressure of Miss Marple's quiet but unyielding observation. She summoned the inspector with her usual politeness, but his expression hardened when he saw the empty space. What has happened?" he demanded. "It appears," Miss Marple said calmly, "that someone has removed key items from the study overnight. The evidence we relied upon yesterday is no longer available for inspection." The inspector's face reddened. "Removed? Stolen? Do you mean to suggest one of the household did this?" Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and steady, met his. "I suggest that someone feared discovery. The very care with which the evidence has been taken speaks of someone intimately familiar with the manor's routines and the timing of our investigations. A stranger could not have acted so precisely." Dawson, who had entered quietly at the mention of the missing items, looked unusually nervous. He cleared his throat and said, "Nothing passed through my hands, Miss Marple. I was in the kitchens all night, as always." Lady Bramwell's composure, usually so perfect, faltered almost imperceptibly. "This is most irregular," she said, her voice measured but thin. Of course, I would never—" She stopped herself, eyes widening at the implication she almost voiced. Dr. Harwood, for his part, leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled as if calculating. "Curious," he said lightly. "Perhaps the evidence is mislaid. It is not uncommon for such items to be moved inadvertently." Miss Marple smiled faintly, though her knitting rested untouched. Mislaid. She had observed the placement herself the day before. No, this was no accident. The disappearance was deliberate and the perpetrator was clever. She began to reconstruct the possibilities. The night had been dark and storm-tossed, and servants had their duties elsewhere. Access to the study was limited. Only Dawson held the key regularly, and only the household members had reason to enter unobserved. Yet one person had been aware enough to remove only the items of significance, leaving the room otherwise undisturbed, a precision she recognized as the mark of someone accustomed to observation. Miss Marple decided to employ a subtle test. She asked Dawson to recount his night in detail, down to the moments he lit lamps, walked the corridors, and checked the larder. His account was meticulous, but it lacked the natural rhythm of someone recounting events freely. Miss Marple noted every hesitation, every overly precise gesture. He was hiding something, not the theft itself perhaps, but knowledge of it, or suspicion, of the person responsible. Lady Bramwell was next. Miss Marple casually mentioned that she intended to place the cigars and matchbook back in the study for careful comparison. The widow's reaction was the smallest of flinches, a subtle tightening around the eyes and lips. The same tension arose when Miss Marple remarked on reviewing the old ledger. Clearly the item's disappearance had unsettled her more than she cared to show. Dr. Harwood, observing the conversation quietly, made a faintly impatient noise, a soft click of his tongue against his teeth. Miss Marple caught it instantly. It was the sound of someone used to controlling situations, whose expertise was now frustrated by uncertainty. Whoever had taken the evidence had misjudged the reach of her observation, or underestimated her patience. By mid-morning, it became evident that the theft had not only delayed progress, but had also rattled the household. Suspicion, once confined to Mr. Alton, now radiated outward, touching even those previously thought beyond reproach. Trust had become fragile, as Miss Marple had predicted, and the criminal's audacity had raised the stakes considerably. Whoever had acted wanted to prevent the truth from emerging, and they had temporarily succeeded. Miss Marple, however, saw opportunity in the disruption. The very act of removing the evidence created a new kind of tension, one that would force errors, expose reactions, and eventually lead to the revelation of the criminal mind. She noted that the thief had underestimated the subtle ways in which people betray themselves. The very shadows of the past she had uncovered, the habits, the small slips of character, and the careful observation of household routines would now converge to reveal the true culprit. She considered the likely scenarios. Dawson might have acted, either on his own or at the suggestion of another. Lady Bramwell might have orchestrated the removal to direct suspicion elsewhere, or Dr. Harwood could have intervened, leveraging his long familiarity with the household to manipulate events. Any one of them, or some combination, could have had motive, knowledge, and opportunity. But Miss Marple sensed that only one thread, when tugged carefully, would unravel the knot completely. As she moved through the manor, checking windows, doors, and less obvious passages, she realized that the criminal had left a trace, not a fingerprint or note, not a discarded object, but something far subtler, a pattern of behavior. The household was reacting to absence, to the missing evidence, and in their reactions lay the truth. Some were too calm, others too alert, some feigned ignorance, others glanced repeatedly at the spaces where the objects had been. Miss Marple returned to her corner with her knitting. She allowed the tension to settle, letting each subtle reaction accumulate in her mind. The theft of the evidence had seemed a setback, a deliberate act to bury the case, yet in reality it had provided a richer canvas. The criminal's desperation had revealed more than any formal investigation could. She understood now that the path forward required patience. The missing items could not be replaced immediately, but the ripples they created through the household's behavior were far more valuable. Trust had been shattered, the stakes had risen, and the criminal had shown themselves willing to act boldly. Yet boldness is rarely perfect, and cracks appear in even the most careful facade. The shadows of the manor seemed to grow deeper as evening fell, but Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. She knew that while the evidence was gone, the truth was not lost. The criminal had overreached, and human nature had already begun to betray them. Patience and observation would now do what theft could not, reveal the hidden hand that had orchestrated Sir Bramwell's death. The manor was quieter than usual that evening, though the storm from earlier in the week had left puddles glinting on the gravel outside, and a damp chill clung to the air. Miss Marple sat in her corner, knitting quietly, her eyes sweeping the room with calm vigilance. The theft of the evidence the day before had set the household on edge, and she had spent hours observing subtle behaviours, nervous glances, slight hesitations, fleeting gestures of concealment. Every small motion was a thread she could follow, but the knot of the mystery remained tightly wound. The stillness was broken suddenly by a scream from the upper corridor. Miss Marple's knitting needles froze mid-air as she rose to her feet. The sound was sharp, desperate, and unmistakable. Instantly the household was on alert. Doors opened, footsteps ran across floors, and the inspector appeared in the drawing-room doorway, face pale with tension. "Another incident," he exclaimed. It's Lady Bramwell." Miss Marple and the others hurried upstairs, moving cautiously along the carpeted corridor. At the end of the hall they found the door to Lady Bramwell's private sitting room ajar. Inside, the widow herself lay sprawled across the floor, a crimson stain blossoming across her blouse. She was conscious but weak, gasping for air, and her eyes were wide with shock. On the desk, a small vial lay tipped over, the remainder of its contents a dark, viscous liquid. "Poison," the inspector said, panic creeping into his voice. "Someone's tried to finish what was begun yesterday." Miss Marple bent down beside Lady Bramwell, noting the precise angle of the fall, the way her hands clutched at the desk edge. "No," she said softly, her voice calm despite the tension. "This is not simply an attempt to finish a plan. It is meant to send a message." The widow shivered but nodded weakly, whispering, I didn't touch it. I don't know who—" Miss Marple observed the scene carefully, her eyes taking in every detail. The vial, the desk, the faint smudge on the corner of the blotter. Small trace of powder along the edge of the drawer. Someone had entered while the household slept, or thought they were unobserved, and had taken a bold step. Dawson, pale and stiff, stood just behind them, his hands clenched. I would never. I'd have heard someone. I was up all night, ensuring the windows were secure," he protested. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, noting a subtle twitch in his fingers. Was it fear, or something else? She filed it away, knowing it might become crucial. Dr. Harwood appeared at the doorway next, his face unusually composed, though his eyes flicked with a rapid calculation. "This is a troubling development," he said, almost too smoothly. "Clearly, someone is desperate. We must ensure the safety of the household immediately." The storm outside mirrored the sudden surge of tension within the manor. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly observant. She noted how the attack on Lady Bramwell shifted the dynamic instantly. The household had believed the arrest of Mr. Alton to mark the resolution of the crime. The false victory had lulled them into a temporary calm. But the second act, the attempted poisoning, proved that the villain was not only still free, but several steps ahead. The inspector immediately began locking doors and checking the windows, barking orders to the remaining servants. "No one leaves," he commanded, though his voice trembled with anxiety. "We must find whoever did this before they strike again." Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, allowed her gaze to sweep the room. She had already begun piecing together the implications. Whoever had targeted Lady Bramwell knew the household's routines intimately. They knew she would be alone at that hour, that the vial could be placed in a precise position without detection, and that the act would sow fear and confusion. It was a calculated escalation, designed to obscure their identity and misdirect suspicion. She turned to the inspector quietly. "This is no ordinary escalation," she said. "The person responsible is clever, and they understand how the household functions. They have taken control of the narrative, using fear to manipulate observation. They are not merely reactive, they are proactive, anticipating every move." Her mind returned to the small, unconventional clues she had observed over the past days, the reactions to the cigars, the subtle flinches around the ledger and silver case, the tension over the vanished evidence. Each detail, she realized, was now magnified in importance. The second attack confirmed what she had suspected all along. The criminal was using knowledge, both old and new, to maintain advantage. Miss Marple's attention shifted to the tiny traces left at the scene. The smudge on the blotter, almost imperceptible, suggested hurried handling. The faint powder along the drawer's edge indicated someone had moved objects carelessly or deliberately left a trace to mislead, and the precise choice of vial suggested someone accustomed to using subtle tools to intimidate without immediate detection. She looked around at the household, noting how each person reacted to the attempted poisoning. Lady Bramwell trembled, but tried to steady herself. Dawson's composure was rigid, almost mechanical, yet his eyes betrayed unease. Dr. Harwood's calm was practiced, measured, but she sensed his mind working rapidly, calculating every risk. Even the younger companions shifted uneasily, their nerves fraying under the weight of the second incident. Miss Marple's intuition whispered a warning. The criminal was not merely avoiding detection, they were testing, probing, seeing who could be manipulated, who could be forced into revealing themselves. The attack was a message, a psychological maneuver to keep the household unbalanced. As the night deepened and Lady Bramwell was safely tended to, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to reflect. The case had shifted dramatically. What had seemed like a solvable crime had revealed a new layer of danger. The murderer was no longer confined to a single act of cunning. They were capable of escalation, capable of premeditated misdirection, and dangerously attuned to the weaknesses of the household. The knitting needles rested in her lap, but her mind worked furiously. Every prior observation now gained fresh significance. Every small hesitation, every slight flinch, every unconscious gesture was a potential key to predicting the next move. She knew the next hours would be crucial, not merely to solve a past crime, but to prevent another. The stakes had risen, and the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and the storm clouds lingered low over the manor. Inside, a more subtle storm brewed, one of observation, calculation, and the careful unraveling of a mind several steps ahead. Miss Marple's calm was a foil to the tension, her quiet patience the one weapon she had against an opponent who believed themselves untouchable. The second crime had shifted the entire landscape of the investigation. Now, Miss Marple faced not just the unraveling of a single murder, but the urgent task of anticipating the next move, of guarding against the audacity of a villain who had proven that they could strike when least expected. And she knew, with that quiet certainty born of years of understanding human nature, that the next act of the criminal, whatever it might be, would reveal the true edge of their character, their mistakes, and ultimately their identity. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the manor wrapped in a damp, silvery calm. The previous night's chaos, the attempted poisoning of Lady Bramwell, had cast a shadow over every corner of St. Audley's Manor. The household moved cautiously, each footstep measured, each glance wary. Yet to Miss Marple the tension was not a hindrance but a map, each frayed nerve and small tremor a thread leading toward the truth. She began her day with quiet observation, as she had for several mornings now. While the inspector busied himself with formal interviews and document reviews, Miss Marple wandered among the household, noting the subtleties others dismissed. Dawson polished silver with deliberate care, yet his movements seemed a beat too fast, too exact. Lady Bramwell fussed with papers in the study, her hands trembling slightly as she straightened the documents the previous intruder had disturbed. Dr. Harwood moved with measured composure, yet his eyes lingered on doorways and corners in a way that suggested calculation rather than mere curiosity. Miss Marple's mind, ever attuned to the minor eccentricities of human behaviour, began to link the disparate pieces she had collected over the past days. The missing matchbook, the poisoned cigar, the ledger from years past, the reactions of each household member, all seemed to hover around a single axis, knowledge of habits and routines both old and current. But what was the common thread, the one small detail she had overlooked until now? She paused in the library, noting a slight irregularity in the floorboards by the desk. A faint indentation, barely visible unless one knelt to see it, suggested that something had been moved recently, perhaps in a hurry, perhaps deliberately to mislead. And then her gaze fell on the silver cigar case, which had been returned overnight, slightly misaligned from the centre of the desk. It was almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple recognized it immediately. The placement of the case was deliberate, a subtle message left by the criminal or by someone attempting to manipulate the investigation. Her attention shifted to a conversation she had overheard 2 days prior, almost casually dismissed at the time. Lady Bramwell had remarked, almost in passing, "Sir Bramwell always had his evening cigar before retiring, and he preferred the box nearest the fireplace." The comment had seemed ordinary, a trivial note about his habits, but now, in the context of the missing and returned items, it struck her with clarity. The murderer had exploited this knowledge, arranging the evidence, selecting the poisoned cigar, and orchestrating events to mislead the household and investigators alike. Miss Marple retraced the interactions of the past few days. The matchbook, planted or discovered, the ledger revealing old grudges, the reactions of Dawson, Lady Bramwell, and Dr. Harwood to the staged evidence, all pointed to a meticulous understanding of both human behaviour and household routine. The criminal had relied upon these tiny, overlooked details to craft an illusion of innocence, yet in doing so had left a faint trail for a careful observer. She paused at the window, letting her eyes drift over the manicured gardens outside. It was there, in the quiet attention to detail, that the pattern became unmistakable. The criminal's key mistake had been subtle. They assumed that small, everyday actions would escape scrutiny, that habits would not betray them. Yet each hesitation, each tiny flinch, each overly deliberate gesture had been recorded in Miss Marple's mind. The pattern was no longer hidden. It was a lattice connecting motive, opportunity, and method. Her thoughts turned once more to the behaviour of Dr. Harwood. The doctor's calm, measured manner, combined with the small flinches when certain objects were mentioned, the ledger, the cigar case, even the blank sheet of paper, suggested more than mere propriety or caution. It suggested knowledge, intimate familiarity, and subtle manipulation. The failed poisoning had confirmed that the criminal was willing to escalate, willing to act decisively when threatened with exposure. Miss Marple recalled the small powder trace along the drawer in Lady Bramwell's sitting room, the slight smudge on the blotter. These had seemed minor at first, almost accidental. But now, in the emerging pattern, they were deliberate markers, indicators of both method and confidence. The criminal had sought to control the narrative, to place suspicion carefully upon others, while revealing just enough to distract and mislead. Her eyes drifted toward Dawson, whose behaviour she had noted with careful attention over the past days. The butler's gestures had been meticulous, his attention to duty unwavering, yet the twitch in his hands, the faintly hurried polishing of silver, now seemed less like nervousness and more like a protective vigilance. He had been aware of the criminal's manipulations, perhaps even complicit in some minor capacity, yet he was not the mastermind. His actions were guided by loyalty rather than malice. Lady Bramwell, she realised, had been equally entangled in the web. Her reactions, hesitation, tension, faint flinches, revealed that she had known more than she admitted, that her knowledge of past grievances, of Sir Bramwell's habits, had shaped her movements. Yet she had been cautious, careful not to overstep, not to draw suspicion to herself. Her part in the drama was reactive rather than proactive. The emerging pattern crystallised fully when Miss Marple considered the sequence of events: the discovery of the poisoned cigar, the planting of the matchbook, the theft of evidence, the attempted poisoning, the subtle reactions observed, all pointed to someone who had intimate knowledge of the household and the deceased, someone capable of exploiting both old and new knowledge to manipulate perception. And then it became undeniably clear. There was one figure whose actions, knowledge, and subtle manipulation aligned perfectly with every detail, the person who had observed, calculated, and acted with patience and precision. All the small clues, once seemingly disconnected, now fit together like pieces of a puzzle. The criminal had relied on assumptions about what others would overlook, yet in their confidence they had revealed themselves through behaviour, habit, and an over-reliance on distraction. Miss Marple rose, setting down her knitting. The pattern was clear, the threads converging on a single point. The key to the case had indeed been in plain sight all along. It was not a dramatic clue, not a glaring error or a flamboyant confession, but the cumulative weight of small details, overlooked habits, and subtle behavioural shifts. The criminal had underestimated the power of careful observation, patience, and attention to the seemingly trivial. She allowed herself a faint, satisfied smile. The path forward was clear. With the pattern now fully understood, she could orchestrate the next move to draw the culprit into the open. Every observation, every hesitation, and every subtle sign had been recorded. Now, armed with the knowledge of the pattern, she would set the stage to expose the murderer, not through accusation alone, but by letting their own behaviour betray them. Miss Marple felt the quiet thrill of anticipation. The web of deceit had begun to unravel, and the criminal, confident in their cleverness, would soon find that the smallest of oversights could be their undoing. The pattern had emerged, and with it the key to restoring justice in the shadowed halls of St. Audley's Manor. Miss Marple had spent the morning quietly piecing together the behavioural patterns she had observed over the past several days, her mind tracing each subtle twitch, flinch and hesitation until the outline of the culprit had become unmistakable. The puzzle had always been more than a matter of routine motives: money, jealousy, inheritance, though each of these had played a supporting role. The real heart of the crime lay far deeper, entwined with old grievances, fragile pride, and a consuming obsession. The breakthrough came as Miss Marple examined the ledger she had discovered days before, the one containing the faded note from 15 years prior. The note was modest, almost forgettable, recounting a small embezzlement case involving Sir Bramwell when he was a young lawyer. The culprit had been caught, yet the disgrace had lingered quietly in the background, a whisper of shame in the affected family's memory. Miss Marple considered the young companion, Miss Ethel Whitcomb, and her family's connection. But the true motive was not simply generational revenge, it was far more personal. As she reviewed her observations, she remembered the small, unconventional clues. Dr. Harwood's flinch when the ledger was mentioned, the slight smudge on the blotter in Lady Bramwell's sitting room, and the meticulous yet nervous way Dawson had polished the silver. Each indicated knowledge of past events and, more importantly, the lingering emotional resonance those events held. The crime had been executed not only to manipulate the present, but to resolve a decades-old imbalance in the mind of someone consumed by perceived injustice. It was Dr. Harwood who, in his calm, almost clinical demeanour, had been the orchestrator. At first it seemed improbable, so measured, so trusted, so unobtrusive. But the subtleties now made sense. His motives were rooted in a long-standing desire to correct what he believed to be a moral wrong. Sir Bramwell's legal judgment years ago had humiliated him personally, perhaps not financially, but in terms of professional reputation and ego. For Dr. Harwood, the perceived slight had never faded. It had festered quietly, hidden beneath decades of propriety and patient observation. The theft of the evidence, the poisoned cigar, the second attempt on Lady Bramwell, all were expressions of a mind seeking to balance the scales, meticulously ensuring that the victim would experience the consequences of what Harwood deemed an earlier injustice. Miss Marple recalled the reaction to the unconventional test with the cigars and matchbook. The doctor's flinch had been faint, almost imperceptible, but there had been a flash of recognition and, perhaps, guilt. That small crack, magnified by the pattern of behaviour she had observed over days, revealed the psychology behind the crime. It was not about immediate gain, but about the satisfaction of control, the quiet retribution of a patient mind exacting justice on a scale measured in decades. She also reconsidered Dawson's role. The butler had acted out of loyalty, perhaps even shielding Dr. Harwood in minor ways, responding to an unspoken code of protection. Lady Bramwell had been reactive, her anxiety and flinches reflecting awareness of the latent tensions in her household and her proximity to danger. But it was the doctor who had both knowledge and opportunity, whose intimate familiarity with the manor and its inhabitants allowed him to manipulate events with precision. Miss Marple traced the escalation logically. The initial murder of Sir Bramwell was designed to appear almost accidental, the poisoned cigar arranged so subtly that suspicion would be diverted. The theft of the evidence, intended to frustrate and mislead, had been carefully timed. The second attempt on Lady Bramwell was not merely a failed effort, but a deliberate test, an assertion of control, an opportunity to observe reactions, and a final act in a pattern of psychological dominance. The deeper motive, however, lay not just in pride or humiliation, but in a fascination with the precision of human behavior, the art of manipulation, and the satisfaction derived from orchestrating events to expose character. Dr. Harwood had observed, predicted, and nudged the household like a chess master, moving pieces subtly to achieve a calculated outcome. His mind found excitement in the tension between appearance and reality, in the knowledge that the truth remained hidden beneath layers of assumed routine and civility. Miss Marple reflected on the psychology at play. The doctor's methods were clinical but deeply personal, entwined with his identity and sense of moral rightness. He had convinced himself that the ends justified the means, that correcting a long-forgotten slight through orchestrated chaos was acceptable, even necessary. To him, Sir Bramwell's earlier judgment had been an affront so profound that only meticulous retribution could restore balance, and yet Miss Marple recognised a weakness inherent in this careful construction, the human need for subtle recognition, the difficulty of maintaining complete control over every reaction. It was in these tiny imperfections, the flinch at the ledger, the hesitation over the silver case, the twitch when discussing routines, that the true motive was betrayed. The obsession that had guided Dr. Harwood's actions was inseparable from his pride, his intellect, and the psychological gratification derived from seeing his carefully laid plans unfold. The realization struck Miss Marple with clarity. The villain's genius lay not in physical cunning or brute force, but in psychological manipulation, in the ability to orchestrate events over days, weaving past and present together. Yet that same genius, driven by obsession and emotion, had left traces, small, almost invisible, but visible to someone who observed patiently, who understood the subtle interplay between behavior and motive. She allowed herself a quiet moment to consider the full scope of the crime. The murder of Sir Bramwell, the theft of evidence, the attempted poisoning. Each act was part of a deliberate pattern, yet each was also a reflection of a mind consumed by the past. Dr. Harwood had acted not for wealth, not for social advantage, not for immediate revenge, but for the satisfaction of enacting what he considered a long-overdue correction, the righting of a perceived moral imbalance. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her knitting resting beside her. The hidden motive was now clear. It was a combination of pride, obsession, and the desire to manipulate and control, bound together by years of suppressed grievance. Understanding this psychological depth was essential. It explained why the crimes had been executed with such subtlety, and why the household had been so carefully observed and manipulated. The challenge ahead would be to use this knowledge to draw the villain into the open, without giving them the satisfaction of realizing they had been discovered. The truth of the hidden motive gave Miss Marple the leverage she needed, the insight to predict the next move. She could now anticipate, rather than merely react, knowing the psychological currents that had driven each action to this point. With a steadying breath, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. The layers of misdirection, the false victories, and the vanishing evidence all converged into a coherent whole. The crime, she realized, had never been about what was obvious. It was about the mind behind it, the deep currents of resentment and pride, and the patient, calculating manipulation that had finally escalated into violence. And now, understanding the hidden motive, Missy Marple knew precisely how to set the stage to reveal the true culprit, an act that would not merely expose the criminal, but illuminate the tangled interplay of obsession, intellect, and human fallibility that had made the crime possible in the first place. Miss Marple moved with quiet precision that morning, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag as she wandered through the familiar halls of St. Audley's Manor. She had spent days observing, listening, and noting the tiniest cracks in the carefully maintained facades of the household. Now, with the hidden motive laid bare in her mind, the obsession, pride, and desire for meticulous revenge that had driven Dr. Harwood, she was ready to orchestrate the final confrontation. The manor was unusually still, almost expectant. The household moved cautiously, aware that the investigation had entered a critical stage. Miss Marple allowed them to settle, ensuring that her plan could unfold without interruption. The small, unconventional clues she had placed, the ledger, the silver cigar case, even the carefully arranged tea service, were all positioned to provoke the subtle reactions she needed. It was a psychological trap as much as a practical one, designed to draw out the mind that had orchestrated chaos over the past days. She summoned Dr. Harwood to the drawing room under the pretext of reviewing the household records. His composure was as smooth as ever, but she noted the quickened blink, the faint twitch in his fingers as he approached. He had always been careful, precise, confident in his control over the household, yet the cumulative pressure of her quiet observation now began to press on him. "My dear Dr. Harwood," Miss Marple said softly, arranging the ledger on the table so that its pages were visible. "I have been reflecting on Sir Bramwell's habits, on the unfortunate events of the past days, and on the subtle intricacies of human behaviour. It is remarkable how much one can observe when attention is given to the smallest details." The doctor smiled thinly, his fingers brushing the edge of the table. "Indeed, details are important. One might say they make or break an investigation." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Precisely. And yet, it seems that even the most careful of us can leave traces that are almost imperceptible unless one knows what to look for." Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, settled on him. "Such as the faint smudge on the blotter in Lady Bramwell's sitting room, or the slight misalignment of the silver cigar case." Dr. Harwood's composure faltered for the briefest moment, a fraction of a second, before he masked it with a controlled nod. "Ah, yes. Minor accidents, perhaps." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone light, almost conversational. "Or perhaps indications of intention. I cannot help but notice how certain objects, the ledger, the matchbook, the cigars, evoked reactions that seemed revealing. Tell me, Doctor Harwood, did you ever notice how Sir Bramwell's habits shaped the household's daily rhythm?" The doctor stiffened imperceptibly. "One must observe habits to maintain order," he said carefully. "Exactly," Miss Marple replied, her gaze unwavering. "And those who observe closely sometimes act, when they believe opportunity presents itself, to correct an old injustice perhaps, or to demonstrate control over events." She let the words hang in the air, knitting her observations together into an unspoken accusation. Dr. Harwood's hand twitched toward the back of his chair, a subtle motion that did not go unnoticed. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught it instantly, the gesture of someone calculating, measuring, perhaps contemplating one last desperate move. "You see, Dr. Harwood," she continued, her voice calm and measured, "the pattern of events over the past days is quite revealing. A poisoned cigar, a vanished piece of evidence, an attempted act against Lady Bramwell, each carefully orchestrated. One must wonder who had the knowledge, the patience, and the motive to execute such a series of precise manipulations." The doctor's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time he spoke without full control. You think you know?" Miss Marple nodded, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I do, and the truth is rather simple when you observe carefully. It is not wealth, nor simple revenge, nor petty jealousy that has driven these acts. It is the desire to rectify a perceived wrong, to assert control over the threads of consequence, and to prove that the mind, careful, patient, and meticulous, can dictate outcomes in a world of chance." Dr. Harwood's expression darkened. His calculated calm gave way to tension, fingers tapping subtly against the chair arm. Miss Marple waited, allowing the pressure of observation and deduction to bear down. Every glance, every micro-expression had been catalogued. Now the trap was set not with force, but with expectation. "You have been clever," she said softly, "patient, observant. Yet, as clever as one may be, the human mind cannot suppress the faintest tell. Even the best-laid plans leave small signs, slight hesitation, minute flinches, tiny adjustments in posture. And these signs, Dr. Harwood, have not escaped notice." The doctor's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the door. Miss Marple's eyes, unblinking, followed the motion. "I would not attempt escape, Dr. Harwood. The household is aware, and the authorities are on alert. There is no need for rash actions. What is required now is confession, understanding, and the acknowledgement of what has occurred." A long silence followed, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Dr. Harwood's gaze darted around the room, calculating, weighing, considering options. His mind, so used to orchestrating events, now faced the unyielding scrutiny of someone who had observed every nuance, every hesitation, and every tell. Finally, with a sharp exhale, he sank into the nearest chair, his shoulders sagging, the mask of control slipping. It was necessary, he whispered, voice tight, necessary to correct what had been done to me, to restore balance. I could not allow the past to dictate my life. Yet the world, it had to feel the consequence. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, serene even. "I understand," she said quietly. "But balance, Dr. Harwood, cannot be achieved through secrecy and harm. The consequences of one's actions inevitably ripple outward, affecting those who have no part in the original grievance. It is in these ripples that the truth reveals itself." The doctor's eyes flickered toward the ledger, the silver case, the empty spaces where evidence had vanished and returned. Each item was a testament to his meticulous planning, yet each also revealed his miscalculation, the human element he could not fully control. Miss Marple's quiet patience, her unwavering observation, had illuminated every small imperfection, every psychological tell, every concealed motivation. With a final shudder, Dr. Harwood leaned back, the tension leaving him in one long, defeated exhale. The confrontation was complete, not through dramatic accusation, but through the accumulation of truth, the careful observation of human behavior, and the patient orchestration of subtle pressures that left the criminal with no room to maneuver. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, allowed herself a faint, satisfied smile. The pattern had held, the hidden motive had been revealed, and the careful, measured confrontation had forced the villain into acknowledgement. The case, at last, could be brought to its natural conclusion. The manor had settled into a fragile calm. Dr. Harwood had been formally detained, the household reassured, and the inspector had begun drafting his official report. Lady Bramwell, though still pale from the near-fatal attempt on her life, walked with measured dignity, and Dawson moved through the rooms with his usual careful attention. It seemed, to all but Miss Marple, that the long, tense days of mystery and peril had finally reached their natural conclusion. Miss Marple, however, felt no such certainty. She had witnessed the unmasking of Doctor Harwood, observed his flinches and micro-expressions, traced the subtle pattern of his obsessions. She had orchestrated the final confrontation with precision. And yet, as she moved quietly through the manor's corridors, a small unease prickled her awareness. Something, she realized, remained unsettled. It began in the study, the very heart of the previous chaos. The silver cigar case rested in its proper place, the ledger neatly opened on the desk, and the matchbook had been returned to its original spot. But a small detail drew her eye, a folded scrap of paper, previously unnoticed, tucked beneath the blotter. Its edges were slightly creased, as though someone had placed it, carefully to avoid detection. Curiosity piqued, Miss Marple unfolded the paper. The handwriting was faint, elegant, and unfamiliar. It was a note, brief but cryptic. "He knew too much. I had no choice." The words were so simple, yet their implication was profound. Someone else had acted in the background, someone who had watched, waited, and subtly influenced events, someone whose hand had guided the chaos, even before Dr. Harwood had been revealed as the active agent. A chill passed over Miss Marple. The perfect confrontation she had engineered had exposed Dr. Harwood's motives, but this note suggested that the visible villain had been only part of a more complex design. Someone else had orchestrated conditions, nudged reactions, and perhaps even guided the timing of attacks. The genius of the criminal mind she had confronted might have been manipulated from a shadowy periphery. She reflected on the events that had seemed inexplicable at the time, the theft of evidence, the exact timing of the attempted poisoning, the subtle precision in the placement of the cigar case, the behavioral reactions of each household member. Could all of these have been influenced by a hidden presence, someone who had predicted both Dr. Harwood's moves and her own observations? Her gaze shifted to Dawson. The butler had been tense, meticulous, loyal, but never manipulative. Lady Bramwell, anxious and reactive, had clearly known more than she admitted, but she had not orchestrated the events. Yet the note suggested the presence of an entirely unseen influence, someone whose motives, means and identity had remained hidden until now. Miss Marple's mind raced through possibilities. Could it be that a long-forgotten family member, a distant relative, or perhaps an acquaintance of Sir Bramwell, had maintained a quiet but relentless influence over the unfolding events? Someone who had moved with invisibility, watching from the edges, shaping the narrative while leaving Dr. Harwood to act as the visible agent of chaos. Her attention turned to the margins of the ledger, where small notes and dates had been recorded over years. One entry, previously overlooked, mentioned an old law partner, Mr. Alton, the man initially suspected and then dismissed after his cooperation seemed genuine. Miss Marple examined it carefully. The entry was cryptic, a brief mention of a disagreement, a clause misinterpreted, and a notation of concern over reputations. Could Mr. Alton have been the shadow behind the scenes, directing Dr. Harwood's obsession toward ultimate execution, all while maintaining a facade of innocence? Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the note. He knew too much. I had no choice. If the note referred to Dr. Harwood as the one who knew too much, it implied the writer had orchestrated, or at least guided his actions, forcing him to commit acts he might have hesitated to take on his own. The subtle manipulations, the timing, the precise provocations, it all suggested a mastermind who had remained unseen, manipulating both the villain and the investigator. Her heart quickened. The case was no longer a simple exposure of a single obsessed mind. It was layered, complex, and required a new kind of reasoning. She would need to unravel not only Dr. Harwood's motives, but also the hidden strings pulling him, the unseen hand that had engineered the stage on which he acted. Miss Marple considered the household once more. Dawson, loyal and observant, had surely noticed small irregularities, but lacked the initiative for orchestration. Lady Bramwell's anxiety and attentiveness were reactive, not proactive. That left only someone who had access, knowledge, and cunning enough to manipulate events from the shadows, a person who understood human behavior as intimately as she did, someone who could anticipate responses, exploit weaknesses, and ensure that each step unfolded exactly as intended. She realized the implications immediately. The criminal genius she had confronted, the meticulous, calculating Dr. Harwood, had been, in some sense, a pawn. The true architect remained hidden, using his obsession and knowledge as instruments to achieve their own ends. The final twist was not a revelation of a single villain's psychology, but the recognition that human behavior itself could be orchestrated, subtly but inexorably, by someone who understood both motive and mind. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. She would need to provoke the unseen player, create a situation where their influence would manifest and reveal itself. The note, the small, overlooked behaviors, and the precise timing of every incident now formed a roadmap. It was no longer a question of observation alone. She needed action, subtle and deliberate, to draw the hidden mastermind into the open without tipping off Dr. Harwood, who might unwittingly complicate matters. The quiet manor felt suddenly charged with tension. The household moved through rooms with a tentative caution, unaware that the threads of manipulation extended beyond the visible players. Miss Marple, calm and composed, understood that the final revelation required patience and a carefully engineered situation, an environment in which the true mastermind could no longer conceal themselves. She allowed a small, private smile. The complexity of human behavior had once again revealed its secrets. Dr. Harwood had been exposed, his obsession laid bare, but the true test remained, unmasking the hidden hand that had guided him, orchestrating events with quiet precision, shaping the narrative from the shadows. And so, with the first step of her next plan already forming in her mind, Miss Marple set herself to the task. The final twist had arrived, the challenge sharpened, and the resolution now demanded the same combination of patience, subtlety, and insight that had guided her through every stage of this intricate, unsettling case. Miss Marple moved quietly. Through the drawing-room, her senses alert as the household gathered, under the pretense of an ordinary morning meeting. The manor was calm on the surface, but beneath the polished floors and gleaming silver, currents of tension ran deep. Every eye flicked nervously to one another, every movement measured, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the drama of the past days and now watched with silent anticipation. She had spent the night reviewing every detail: the subtle smudge on the blotter, the misaligned silver cigar case, the faint powder on Lady Bramwell's desk, and, most importantly, the folded note that had been discovered after Dr. Harwood's confrontation. Each small clue now coalesced into a tapestry she could follow with precision. Dr. Harwood had been the visible villain, but the note had revealed a hidden architect, a mind operating in the shadows. Miss Marple understood that the final step would require more than observation. It would require orchestration, patience, and psychological finesse. Dawson brought in tea, moving quietly, aware of the tension, but unaware of the trap being set. Miss Marple allowed her eyes to linger on him, not in suspicion, but to ensure his reactions were measured and honest. Lady Bramwell, pale yet resolute, followed the usual routine, arranging chairs and noting placements with meticulous care. Everyone was present, everyone was under scrutiny. "Dr. Harwood," Miss Marple began, her voice calm, deliberate, drawing him to the centre of the room. "You have provided us with much insight into the motives behind the recent tragedies. Your actions were meticulous, precise, and, I dare say, clever." She allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of her words settle. "And yet, it seems there is one more piece of the puzzle, one more hand that guided these events from a place of concealment." The doctor's brow furrowed, and a faint flush crossed his cheeks. "You speak in riddles, Miss Marple," he said, though a trace of uncertainty now crept into his tone. "I speak only of truth," she replied softly. "The note discovered after the final confrontation was not written by you, Dr. Harwood. It bears the handwriting of someone with equal familiarity, equal understanding, and, dare I say, equal cunning. Someone who sought to direct your actions, knowing your precise reactions, and using you as an instrument to achieve their own ends." Her eyes swept the room, landing carefully on Mr. Alton. The man stiffened, his previous calm veneer faltering ever so slightly. Miss Marple's gaze lingered, subtle yet unyielding, noting every micro-expression, every twitch of muscle, every flicker of hesitation. "You see," she continued, "the real mastermind is not the one whose hands enacted the poison or removed the evidence. It is the one who orchestrated these events from behind a veil of apparent innocence, who nudged circumstances and influenced reactions, and who ensured that every detail would serve a hidden purpose. This person understood habits, weaknesses, and loyalties, manipulating them with patience and skill." Mr. Alton swallowed audibly. Miss Marple's gaze softened slightly, though her tone remained steady and authoritative. "Mr. Alton, the ledger you prepared years ago, the seemingly trivial entries, the precise knowledge of household routines, and your subtle positioning of objects were not mere coincidence. You guided Dr. Harwood's actions, ensuring that events unfolded according to a plan you conceived long ago." The room was silent, each person absorbing the revelation. Dr. Harwood's expression darkened, the mask of composure he had worn so carefully now fractured. Lady Bramwell's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and fear. Dawson's hands tightened on the tea tray, as if bracing against the unspoken tension in the air. "You used his obsession, his sense of past injustice to achieve your own ends," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but piercing. "You understood his psychology better than he understood himself, manipulating his pride and his need for retribution to serve your hidden agenda. And yet, even your careful orchestration left traces, small and imperceptible, that revealed the truth to those who observed closely." Mr. Alton's lips pressed together, his hands clenched into fists. For a moment it seemed he might attempt some final act of defiance, but the weight of Miss Marple's scrutiny held him firmly in place. I did what had to be done," he stammered, voice tight with controlled anger. "Sir Bramwell, he deserved to pay for what he had done, and when the others, they interfered, I had no choice but to ensure the plan continued." Miss Marple inclined her head, acknowledging his confession. "Yes, But even the best-laid plans are vulnerable to observation, deduction, and the quiet accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant details. Every flinch, hesitation, smudge, misalignment, and micro-expression formed a trail that could not be erased. Justice, though slow and measured, finds a way when one overlooks even the tiniest thread. Dr. Harwood exhaled sharply, the realization dawning that he had been a pawn, an instrument wielded by someone who understood him and the household better than he had realized. His shoulders slumped, and the tension that had guided his precise, deliberate movements over days dissipated in a single, exhausted breath. Lady Bramwell, though still trembling, found a measure of relief. The veil of unseen manipulation had been lifted, and the danger that had haunted the manor began to dissipate. Even Dawson, quiet and observant as ever, allowed a faint, relieved exhale, his hands unclenching as the tension in the household began to ease. Miss Marple rose from her chair, placing her knitting neatly on the table. She addressed the room as a whole, her tone gentle yet firm. "Observe carefully, my friends. The true value of attention, patience and observation lies not only in exposing the visible villain, but in uncovering the unseen forces that guide events. The small, overlooked clues, the blotter smudge, the misaligned silver case, the cryptic note, revealed a pattern that no one else discerned. And it is in recognizing these patterns that one truly understands the mind of both the perpetrator and the manipulator." She allowed a moment of quiet reflection, letting the weight of her words settle among the assembled household. The inspector, who had been watching silently, nodded in acknowledgement, recognizing the depth and subtlety of Miss Marple's deductions. As for Mr. Alton, justice would follow its proper course. He would face questioning, scrutiny, and the consequences of his actions, though his careful manipulation had allowed him to remain hidden for longer than most would have expected. The unsettling reality remained. Even the most meticulous schemes leave traces, and even the most patient criminals must eventually contend with the sharp eye of a detective who sees the invisible threads. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, satisfied smile. The chaos of the past days had unravelled, the hidden motives exposed, and the intricate web of manipulation illuminated. Yet, as always, she reflected on the quiet truth of human nature. Cleverness and deceit may delay justice, but they cannot indefinitely escape the careful observation of those who notice what others ignore. The manor, once tense and shadowed by fear, began to breathe again. Lady Bramwell moved with cautious confidence, Dawson resumed his careful routines, and the inspector began finalizing the reports. And in her corner, Miss Marple quietly picked up her knitting, her mind serene, yet alert, ever aware that in human behaviour there will always be subtleties to observe, patterns to detect, and truths to reveal. Justice had been served, or at least it had been illuminated. And though the resolution was satisfying, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the small, almost imperceptible signs that had guided her to the ultimate truth, proving once again that the keen eye, patience, and careful reasoning were the sharpest tools in any detective's arsenal. The case was concluded, but the lesson remained. Even in apparent closure, the subtle intricacies of human motives and the hidden patterns of behaviour always demand the vigilance of those willing to see beyond the obvious. And for Miss Marple, the satisfaction of having discerned them, quietly and thoroughly, was reward enough. The morning sun slanted through the tall windows of St. Audley's Manor, catching the dust motes in a golden haze. Outside, the gardens shimmered with dew, tranquil and orderly, as if nothing sinister had ever occurred within the house. Inside, the household had begun to settle into a fragile rhythm, yet a sense of lingering unease hovered in the air, subtle and almost imperceptible. Miss Marple moved among them quietly, observing, not with suspicion, but with the gentle awareness of someone who knows that the human mind never rests entirely, even when the apparent danger has passed. Dr. Harwood had been taken into custody, Mr. Alton confronted and questioned, the ledger and other critical evidence secured. The inspector had praised Miss Marple's acuity, his tone formal, but tinged with awe at the subtlety of her deductions. Lady Bramwell moved through her morning routines with a cautious ease, still pale but reassured that the immediate threat had been neutralized. Dawson resumed his duties, quieter than usual, his loyalty undiminished, but his movements marked by careful observation, as though even he suspected that the manor had not entirely released its hold over them. Miss Marple paused at the top of the grand staircase, gazing down at the drawing-room. The objects she had scrutinized so carefully, the silver cigar case, the ledger, the blotter, and even the small folded note, lay in their rightful places. Each item told its part of the story, but one detail tugged at her mind like a stubborn thread refusing to be fully woven. She had traced the hidden patterns, exposed the manipulations, and revealed the mastermind behind the orchestrated chaos. Yet, despite the apparent resolution, there remained a question unanswered, a faint tremor of inconsistency that she could not yet place. It had begun with the folded note, the cryptic words, "He knew too much. I had no choice." Though she had exposed Mr. Alton as the hidden architect, there was something about the phrasing, the ink, the subtle pressure of the handwriting that suggested another layer, perhaps a minor accomplice, perhaps a final message intended for someone else entirely. Miss Marple examined the note again, turning it in her hands, letting the faint indentation of the pen strokes reveal what might have been overlooked. Her mind traced the events one final time, carefully retracing each movement, each hesitation, each subtle reaction of the household over the past days. The small smudge on the blotter, the misaligned cigar case, Dr. Harwood's micro-expressions, and Mr. Alton's almost imperceptible flinches, all were now clear and accounted for. Yet there remained the matter of a faint scent in the study, a trace of tobacco unlike the cigars that had caused so much trouble, lingering near the window as though someone had been present very recently. It was too faint to have drawn the attention of anyone but her, but it implied that even after all the revelations, another presence had moved through the rooms. Miss Marple's eyes followed the trail of sunlight across the polished floor, her mind noting the subtle impressions left in the carpet where the edges of furniture had been shifted slightly during the past nights. The shifts were minor, almost negligible, but they suggested movement, someone working quietly in the shadows, a participant who had been careful to remain unseen, perhaps even after the apparent resolution of the case. She allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. A mystery, she thought, never truly ends. She descended the staircase with measured steps, her keen eye scanning each familiar surface. Even the neat rows of books on the library shelves, which had seemed so orderly in the aftermath, bore tiny inconsistencies in spacing and alignment. Someone had handled them recently. A visitor? A returning household member? Or simply another thread in the intricate web of human behaviour that she had come to understand so well? In the drawing-room, the inspector rose as she entered. "Miss Marple," he said with a polite nod, "I hope you will allow me to file this as closed." The mastermind is apprehended, the motive revealed, the evidence accounted for. I must admit, I've never seen a case so layered. Miss Marple smiled faintly, settling into an armchair. "Oh, Inspector, layered is a word far too modest. Human behaviour is infinitely layered, and sometimes even the cleverest among us leave traces too subtle for most to perceive. The case, for now, may appear closed, but the truth, like the threads of a spider's web, often extends farther than the eye can see." Lady Bramwell approached, her hands clasped nervously. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "will there be any further danger? Should we be concerned?" Miss Marple shook her head, though the shadow of caution remained in her mind. "Not immediate danger, my dear. Those responsible for the recent misdeeds are under scrutiny. Yet one must always remain observant. Human motives are rarely simple, and curiosity or ambition may yet stir in unexpected quarters. What seems resolved may only be the surface of deeper undercurrents." The inspector, noting the faint tension in her words, exchanged a glance with Dawson, who had paused mid-step, a hand lingering over a tea tray as though he too sensed the subtle warning in Miss Marple's calm voice. The household, reassured outwardly, yet felt the ripple of uncertainty that only the keenly observant could perceive. Miss Marple allowed her eyes to drift toward the window, where sunlight glinted off the dew-soaked garden. A figure had passed by earlier, though unnoticed by anyone else, a fleeting shadow along the path that now seemed curiously significant in hindsight. She could not yet place the identity of that visitor, nor could she be certain of their intentions, but it was enough to remind her, and any careful observer, that mysteries rarely end neatly. She rose, gathering her knitting and walking toward the door. As she passed the study one final time, her gaze lingered on the silver cigar case and the ledger, then drifted to the faint scent of tobacco by the window. A tiny smile curved her lips. There was more to understand, more to uncover, though not today. Patience, observation, and quiet reasoning would reveal the truth when the moment arrived. At the threshold of the manor, she paused and turned, her gaze sweeping over the assembled household one last time. "Do not forget," she said softly, almost to herself, "the smallest detail may carry the greatest significance. One must always notice what others overlook." And with that, she stepped into the morning light, the manor behind her bathed in a calm that was only partially earned. The threads of human behaviour, of hidden motives and subtle manipulations, stretched endlessly outward, waiting to be discovered, waiting to entangle once more in another quiet corner of the world. Even as she walked away, her mind alive with possibilities, Miss Marple knew that the story was not truly finished. A lingering question remained, the faintest scent, a shadow that had passed, a cryptic note whose author had not yet been fully revealed. And though the house had been restored to relative peace, the promise of another puzzle, another web of human intrigue, was already beginning to stir in her imagination. A mystery never ends. It only waits for the observant, the patient, and the perceptive to notice the first imperceptible sign that a new story has begun.